So I'm super excited today to be here with Miss Felice Belle. Just a little background on Felice and full disclosure. I think I've known Felice for 3 decades now. It's been a long time. Yes, I met Felice in middle school, where we had a ton in common, namely science class. But anyway, today I'm kicking off my She's a Boss series, part of the UnComXn Minds for ComXnwealth, and I'm talking with 4 incredible women during these series, all from different walks of life, doing different things. And I hope that some of their experiences, some of their stories will resonate with you and what you're doing. So today, as I mentioned, we're welcoming Felice Belle. Felice, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Felice. I'm a poet, a playwright, sometimes podcaster, all around storyteller, originally from Mount Vernon, New York, currently a resident of Brooklyn.
When you say a resident of Brooklyn, I feel like you have some deep Brooklyn roots.
I mean, Brooklyn, I feel like Brooklyn's my second home. Like I spent my summers here growing up. I would spend at least a month at my aunt's house in Flatbush every summer. So I feel like I grew up in Brooklyn too, but I didn't, right?
So you're not going to claim that Brooklyn native status. Okay.
I'm not, I know my place.
Okay. I think that's important for all the BKs.
Yeah. There are boundaries. I'm from Money and Mount Vernon. Love for Brooklyn.
Let's rep it hard. When I think about kind of all the things that you've done, like that was a pretty modest self-introduction. When I think about all the things that you've done, from being, a SlamMaster to a poet to an author, a chief storyteller, a professor, I can keep naming things. I just feel like you've gone through a very rich career, and really kind of embody this whole sentiment of the Renaissance individual right now. Can you tell us a little bit about the path that you took and how you made those transitions?
Sure. I mean, my parents are from Guyana, South America. My brothers and I were the first generation born in America. So I very much feel like, although in America I identify as Black, my history, my culture, the music, the food is all West Indian.
Yeah.
And so I remember once asking my mom permission to major in theater. And the response was very clear. That's not a major. Like, that's not, you can do that on the side. You can do that for fun. But in my household, it was kind of like you could be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And I had a genuine love of science and math. So I went with engineering. I went to Columbia because I didn't want to leave New York. I wanted to be in the city. And when I was majoring as an engineer, I started writing poetry. Like, it was always a love of mine, that language and what you could do with it. I also used to recite poems as theater, right? I remember memorizing Phenomenal Woman by Maya Angelou and performing it as a monologue, right? In college, I kind of felt like, oh, what if I could write something of my own and read it on stage? What would happen then, right? And I remember reading, we had an open mic at the Intercultural Resource Center called Strange Fruit. I remember reading a poem about hair, one of my very first poems, and having people come up to me and say that they identified with it, right? And I thought it was some personal experience that no one else would get. To be able to create something that moved other people, I feel like, oh, that's something I want to keep doing. While I was in college is also when I made my first trip to the New York Poets Cafe, which would become my poetry home in New York, to go and watch the poets and the MCs and just be astounded by what they were doing with words and language, and eventually got the courage to get up on that stage myself, and then became the host of the Friday Night Slam. Every Friday night, at least in my 20s, it seems like it was spent there at the New Eurekan.
So that's an interesting point that you bring up about your words really touching somebody else's life. How can you tell us about one of the most impactful experiences of your poetry or one of your plays and that moving you forward?
I don't know if I have one example. For me, it was sort of the idea that that was possible at all, right? Like,
Yeah.
I had been touched by other people. Like, I remember being in high school and finding Entazaki Shange's For Colored Girls on the shelf and like looking at the cover of that book and being like, I'm a colored girl, she's a colored girl. And like, I read it, I didn't get most of it. I was too young to understand what was happening, but it ended up being one of these texts I would come back to again and again over the course of my life. So I was used to other people doing that to me. Like, I was the kind of kid who would rather read a book in the window all day Sunday, and my mom would be like, "You've got to go out and play. Like that's what kids do." And I was like, "I'm really into this story. I don't even remember what the story was, but like it had my attention, right? It was having an effect on me, and so having the awareness that I could create something that would have that effect on somebody else felt like some sort of strange superpower that I wanted to engage in."
That's amazing because I feel like my experience with art has always been that transformative power of art. And so I totally, what you're saying about that just totally resonates. You mentioned your West Indian parents. You know that I am classic Black, so I don't have that.
Oh, classic Black. I haven't heard that before. I love it.
Pointing it. I don't like just Black. That makes it sound a notch down, like you want to add something else. I'm classic Black. However, my parents had the same standpoint as those West Indian parents. And I always wished I was a fly on the wall for that family meeting when you came home and you said, "Mom, Dad, I know you just paid for this amazing Columbia education for me to be an industrial engineer, but I decided that I'm gonna pursue poetry." How did that meeting go?
So here's the thing. I feel like my first degree was very much for my parents, right? Like, I'm glad I got it. I learned a lot. I made great friends, but like, I was like, here it is, you guys. I did it. Whatever I do next is for me, right? And I'm not asking you to pay for it. Like, you don't really have to approve. Like, I think when I started grad school, I was still living with my parents, and then I eventually got an apartment maybe a couple months in. But I was like, it was sort of really me announcing I was going to make decisions for myself. I remember telling them I applied to, I think, one school, NYU Gallatin, for the master's program because it was individualized study. You could create your own major. And so I remember them asking me what I would do with the degree. And I don't know if I had clear sense, but I knew that I wanted to teach, I wanted to write, and I wanted to perform, right? Those are the three things I knew I wanted to do. So they didn't fight me on it. My parents' thing is always, you have to be able to house, feed, and clothe yourself. And if you can do that, go for it, right? So I went for it. And my experience at the master's level was amazing because I felt like it was an adult version of the show Fame. Everyone was so creative and doing so many different things. Like the joke at Gallatin is that you don't have a major, you have a concentration, and it could be like up to 10 things, let's say. And so my concentration was like in poetry and performance and playwriting and the politics of all of those things, right? Compared to my undergraduate program where literally somebody handed you a sheet of paper and it's like, these are the classes you're going to take for the next 4 years, and maybe senior year you get one elective, right? Mm-hmm. Gallatin really like, you get to decide what you're doing here and how you want to do it. And so there was something really liberating about that for me. And I ended up a few years later, or maybe 10 years later, getting my MFA, right? Because to teach at the college level, you need a terminal degree, and a master's isn't a terminal degree. And
so, okay, that's actually a great transition into what I wanted to talk about next, because I mean, let's connect those dots with the program at Gallatin. I've been exploring a lot kind of this concept of the Renaissance person. And are the 2020s, or really the aughts, just birthing, creating these Renaissance people, and people who actually are able to attain the highest levels in multiple disciplines, right? So it used to be the concept of focus on one thing and be the master of that one thing. How do you feel about that? Do you think that's possible? Do you think that your program also gave you kind of that broader vision to believe that that's possible and show you pathways to achieve it?
I mean, I love the concept of a Renaissance person. I think humans are Renaissance people, and it gets socialized out of us, right? Like little kids, you ask them what they want to be. They want to be a doctor and a basketball player and an astronaut. And like, we don't say, no, you can't be all those things. We're like, that's awesome, little kid, dream big. And then like somewhere along the way, it's like, choose one and do that. And whether or not it makes you happy, right? Like just choose one. And Michelangelo is known for his art. He was also an engineer. William Carlos Williams is known as a poet. He was also a doctor. And Tazaki, who I love, was a playwright, a poet, a short story writer, right? An essayist. Like, we all have that in us. And I think it has to be nourished, right? If you don't have examples of it in your life, if no one is saying this is possible for you, then you might think you have to choose one. But I think what's interesting about the 2020s is that the technology is helping people sort of demonstrate to the world all the things they can be at one time.
How so?
Like doctors are on TikTok, right? Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's some dentist that I like who makes viral dance videos. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm into that. I don't want my dentist doing it in the office, but I appreciate this guy can do it, right? Like, sports, right? I'm a I don't know. I am not into sports. But let's say I'm a basketball player, but like I have an interest in, you know, feeding hungry kids. Like I get to start a foundation, right? Like there are so many examples of it that if you are interested in more than one thing, why not pursue it?
And I keep seeing it. I keep seeing it over and over where it's surprising the breadth that people demonstrate. And it shouldn't be surprising, right? Because we're all complex. You
Can I
mentioned
say one more thing about that?
oh, absolutely.
So there's a book that I love. It's called The Big Leap. I read it every time I'm about to leave a job. But the author, I think, is Gay Hendricks, and he talks about living in your zone of genius, right? And something about this rings true to me, this idea that we all have a zone of genius where you are using your unique strengths and talents and gifts in a way that is fulfilling financially, spiritually, emotionally, right? Like you're not struggling through it, you're not suffering to do it. Like the world, the universe, the road is rising up to meet you because you are doing the thing that you're purposed to do. And so I think part of having multiple talents, right, is to use them. My mom would always say, if I complained about like a job I hated, she would say, bloom where you're planted. And I would kind of resent her for it. But then I started, right, just because I'm oppositional sometimes. But like, then I started doing that, right? Like, if I'm here, what can I do with what I've got here? And then that leads to the next opportunity.
You did mention TikTok in your last response. Interesting. Tell me a little about your thoughts on how large a role social media plays in your space, how you use it, if you use it, and if not, why don't you use it?
You know, I kind of feel like, I don't know, that generation of people that was listening to the radio and then televisions became a thing, right? And I'm like, but the radio's awesome. So there's something about me that loves being in the room, right? Like coming from the theater, there's no substitute for me for the space of being in a theater with live people and actors on stage. And if you miss the moment, you just miss it, right? So there's something about social media where everyone is recording everything that they're doing that makes me feel like we're missing the moment because we're trying to capture it on film as opposed to just being present for it.
Mm.
That's one part. The other part is I've got 24 hours in the day and I get to choose how I want to spend that time. And I don't really want to spend it creating content for the internet. Now, let me be really clear. I value people who create content for the internet because during the last year, it was a rough year, and like the meme ministry saved my life, right? Like my heart, like there are just certain like another platform that I love is the Nat Ministry, right? Which is an actual platform because I felt like I was running myself ragged last year, and it wasn't until I started resting that I was able to feel all of my emotions, feel like a real human being, start creating again. But the fact that she connects the need for rest to being revolutionary when it's placed in contrast to grind culture and white supremacy and capitalism and this idea that we're supposed to be producing all of the time. So yeah, I feel like if I get to choose where I want to spend my time, I want to spend it in the real world. I value social media and the fact that it can connect people, but creative energy, like time, I just can't. Like I remember reading a story about Ryan Coogler about why he doesn't have any social media. And I'm like, he's one of the most famous directors in the world. I think there's this idea that there's only one way to do things. There's only one way to be a creative. And I just don't think that's true.
So, how do you think about the amplification of your messages, right? So you're a storyteller at heart.
Mm.
How do you think about amplifying those stories that you believe are, central to your experience and the human experience?
I mean, I think I do it in the arenas that I choose, right? So I can do that in writing in a book, right? A book's not Instagram, but somebody's going to pick up that book the way I picked up that book when I was in seventh grade and discover it, right? I worked at the Brooklyn Public Library a few years ago in the adult learning program, and I was working with adults who are learning to read and write. A lot of my students were West Indian and from Africa, like they felt very much like family to me. And one of the projects I did there was to create a play based on those students' writing and perform it for the public. And that's amplifying, right? The stories of the people that I care about in a space where they can engage with it and invite their families to participate. And so I think it was like there are a million stages in the world, right? And I'm going to be on a couple of them and I'm going to make the most of those experiences. And other people are going to shine on other stages, right? And like make the most of those experiences. And to me, there's no, we need more stories, period. I feel like culturally speaking, we tell the same stories over and over again. And I am interested in the stories we haven't heard,
Yeah,
right? They has to do with a specific population. I want to make sure that population has access, right? Like I'm not doing it for somebody else. I'm doing it for the people involved.
right.
Mm.
Well, that's really interesting. So I feel like, obviously this whole concept of storytelling, regardless of what phase you've been at in your life, this whole concept of storytelling has been a constant, right? Um,
Mm.
as a poet, as an author, as a teacher,
Mm.
apparently as a librarian, as a sometimes podcaster, right? It just stays constant. How do you think about connecting those stories, or do you think about the connection between those stories and how the evolution of those stories, those moments match your own personal development and evolution?
I think the types of stories I want to tell probably change over time. Um, I am most interested in matters of the heart. So if my heart is moved or if something tugs at my emotion, like it feels like a story worth telling. There's a poet that I love, Jericho Brown, and I read an interview with him recently. And his last collection won the Pulitzer, and he was saying that he felt like, I'm going to paraphrase it poorly, but it was something to the effect of that collection was the most sort of authentic expression of his soul on a page,
Oh
right?
wow. Okay.
Right. And so I keep thinking about so now I'm thinking about that, right? Like when I look at my own work, is this the most authentic expression of myself on the page or on the stage or in whatever space I'm in? And I think that for me currently is a driving force in deciding what story I want to tell and how I want to tell it.
All right, we have come to the end of our time. It's been a great time. I know that I've learned a lot. I hope that everyone else will have learned a lot. But what's next for you? What's in the hopper? What do you have coming up?
So I haven't published a book of poetry yet. That's something that I'm interested in doing. So I've been working on that manuscript. I also just finished my first pandemic play, which is exciting because it took me a long time to start creating anything new over the last year. And so I submitted that to a festival, but I'll probably keep working on it and see where it goes. And then my brother, who I adore, is a graphic designer and is working on an animated show. And so I'm doing some script work with him.
All right. Well, this has been excellent and amazing. Any last thoughts, comments?
I love you and thank you for having me.